Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom. Good afternoon, friends, and welcome to another episode of Faith and Science in Catholic Schools, hosted by WCAT Radio in partnership with the Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology, located in St. Louis, Missouri, and also available online at faithscience.org. This show was designed to interview Catholic school teachers on the various ways they teach their students that there is no conflict between our faith and our science. In short, the teaching of science in light of our faith. See faithscience.org for hundreds of free teaching modules from grades K through 8 concerning the relationship between faith and science. I have with me today Lauren Lester, who is a physics instructor and robotics coach and Scholar Bowl coach at Rosati-Kain High School in St. Louis, Missouri. Hello, Lauren, and welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you.
Lauren, we can start out, if you don't mind, by if you would tell us a little bit about yourself and about your role at Rosati-Kain High School.
Sure, yeah. So, I grew up in a small rural town about a little south of St. Louis. We drive about an hour and get into farmlands and vineyards, and I went to a small Catholic grade school there and attended public high school. I went to the University of Missouri for my undergraduate studies. I got bachelor's degrees in physics and in math. And then I transferred to the University of Missouri in St. Louis for my graduate work. So I worked as a TA. I taught the labs for the introductory physics courses, and I got my master's degree in physics. And while I was there, I also completed coursework to get secondary certification to teach high school. And once I completed that, I was hired at Rosati-Kain. I've been here for 12 years. We're an urban, all-girls school and very diverse race and economic status, and even in faith background. And so I teach freshman conceptual physics, and I also teach a senior class. It's a dual enrollment college credit class through St. Louis University. And I'm the robotics coach. We have the first all-girls robotics team at kind of the highest levels where we compete that was in the St. Louis region. So that's pretty exciting. And I'm also a wife and mother. I have 5 children who are 10 years to 5 months old.
Oh, my. That's quite a range.
It is.
So you'll have children on the whole spectrum of elementary and middle and high school.
Yes, I will.
Well, God bless you. And so your work as a physics instructor is something that will give them a whole childhood of crafts, I imagine.
Yeah, definitely. They one of my children especially, already wants to be an engineer when he grows up. He's 7, so he's always asking a lot of questions about science and the things he sees around him. So it's a lot of fun.
That's very cool. Well, as you know, a lot of people in this world are very interested in how the natural world works and how the hard sciences help us demonstrate the way things are put together and the way things connect with one another and so on. So the hard sciences provide us with a sort of Lego building blocks for discovering the world around us, from biology, which teaches us about living creatures, to physics, which teaches us about mechanics of things and the cosmos and so on, to chemistry, which teaches us the composition of things and how various chemicals interact to create various new and exciting and interesting kinds of opportunities for human exploration of who we are in relation to where we are. But many people say, well, all of these things that provide us with a way to extend our senses into the world and better understand how this world works, these things cannot demonstrate the existence of God, and therefore God must not exist. So it's quite a road that we who are scientists walk in conversation with our faith, and our Catholic faith in particular. Would you have anything to say about that and how it affects your area of teaching as a scientist?
Sure, yeah. Well, I think, just from a pedagogical standpoint, talking about faith and science in the physics classroom teaches critical thinking skills just in ways that, just dealing with the scientific material can't. They're really important questions that the kids have to engage with and think about how science, relates to those questions. And I think, it's important to, I'm going to teach my kids about science and what it can do and celebrate the advances that we've made. But I think it's equally important for them to understand the limitations of a discipline. I think that's true in any discipline. We have to recognize that there are certain questions that science just can't answer, like you said, and certain things it can't prove or disprove. And we need to be able to recognize when we need to look for those answers in other places.
Certainly. So those things that science can prove and disprove would be, we know that they're physical and we know that they're material.
Right.
Is it possible for science to disprove a metaphysical or an immaterial reality?
Right, exactly. Yeah, there are certain things that are just beyond our ability to measure or to test, and those kinds of things, the existence of things outside our universe, is just something science can't ever really deal with.
Certainly. But is it possible for science to, in our discovering the world and its help for us to discover the world, is it possible for our science to help us also encounter the creator of that world?
Yeah, definitely. Some of the resources I use in my class talk a lot about the physical evidence that there had to be some creator. Study of things like entropy and energy and the study of the Big Bang. We see out of actual physics theories and proofs that there had to be something there before. And putting it as simply as, nothing can come from nothing, that seems to be something that resonates with students really well. So, yeah, there are things that can give us the sense that there really must be something out there that that's beyond what we can see and measure. And one of the resources I use in my classroom is a documentary, and they interview physicists. And the physicists talk really beautifully about how their study of cosmology and creation has led them to believe that there has to be something greater than what we can physically see in our universe.
Certainly, and there are physicists who helped us better understand that universe who were also strong people of faith. So, for instance, Father George Lemaitre, who came up with the idea of the Big Bang. There's physics right there.
Right, yeah, definitely.
But it does seem paradoxical to many who engage in this conversation that we would say, well, science doesn't have the tools to disprove faith in God, yet it does have the tools to help us strengthen our faith in God.
Yeah, that's true. I think
there should be some way that we can respond to that, and what you just said is part of that response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it really just comes down to understanding whatever discipline you're learning, in this case physics and science, and knowing where its limitations lie.
When we think of creation, when we see anything around us, or we see any process, take any physics principle. For instance, even those things that you put together with robots in your robotics coaching. If you were to walk into an empty gymnasium and a robot started walking up to you, what would be the first thing you would do in your encounter with that robot?
Right. Well, you'd look for who's driving it or who had built it.
Right. So every creation, there's some creator behind it, it would seem.
Right.
And while our senses cannot touch that which is metaphysical or that which is material, it would seem that we would at least look for whoever's driving the car or the robot, as it were. So how do you introduce this conversation to your students? If you were to really get them in a physics class, into a conversation about your faith, or at least demonstrating whatever physical principle it is that you're providing, demonstrating that in light of your faith, how would you do it?
Sure, yeah. Well, I can give you some specific examples. So with the freshmen, I use a resource. It's Father Robert Spitzer of the Magis Center, which I'm sure we'll mention a few times. He has a video series called the Reason Series, and it's 5 episodes that are sort of targeted to young high school students, freshmen and sophomores. And so I like to use those 5 videos sort of periodically throughout the year as the content in each specific video just kind of dovetails with what we're teaching in class. So, for example, the first episode of it talks about the scientific method and how the scientific method works and what science can and can't prove. And so I show that at the beginning of the year because almost every science class you walk into at the beginning of the year is going to be talking about the scientific method. And so I think it's a way to reinforce the faith-science conversation as scientific because they're hearing about the faith aspect of it, and it directly matches what they're learning about in the science classroom. So I think that helps them to see that. And then I'm able to kind of refer back to it as I teach. So it kind of opens up that conversation. And I think it's just helpful for students to see that there is a faith-science conversation and that, that it's open, that they can come to class and ask questions, about theology, even though they're in science class. And then they can see how it relates to what we're talking about. With the seniors, I introduce it a little bit differently. I mentioned that documentary earlier. I show that at the end of the year, and we have a discussion about how we've spent the year learning how we apply physics to everyday things around us, how their car moves down the highway or how their cell phone charges. But it's also important to think about how we apply physics to the faith part of our everyday life, which is probably the most important part, right? And so I think that documentary does a beautiful job of showing how people who study physics every day see that reality in what they do.
Have you ever had a student come up to you and say, Mrs. Lester, the physics that I'm studying, I don't think that there is a God because I know now how things work and therefore I'm as smart as God?
No, I have not had them approach it that way. I do get pushback sometimes. Usually it's because the kids already sort of had this idea in mind. They come to us with their own experiences they've already had outside of school. And so I do get pushback sometimes. But usually even those students will listen and kind of think about it. And I know that I'm at least maybe planting some kind of seed of knowledge or faith in them. But generally it's pretty well received. And I have my students write reflections at the end of the year on what they learned and the questions it answered or maybe the questions they still have. And I'm always pleasantly surprised by the depth of thought they put into it.
And we know that students, especially on the high school level, will have all kinds of eagerness and all kinds of curiosity for how they can apply themselves to the world in which they live. And your discipline, physics, gives them an opportunity to explore that in a way that other disciplines don't. Mm-hmm. Are there any students who have ever used what they've learned in your class and said, Mrs. Lester, this principle you've just given me has really opened my eyes to the fact that God has to exist because there's no way this could have just fallen all together by itself?
Right, yeah. A lot of the reflections I get, especially with the younger students, the freshmen, a lot of them kind of focus on the fact that they hadn't really given it a whole lot of thought. Even if they never really felt a personal conflict there, now they feel sort of prepared, and they're confident that they know these arguments. And I've had a couple students come back to me and tell me that they've had a friend who maybe was kind of asking those same questions or was stuck on those same perceived conflicts. And, they come back and say, hey, can you go over this with me again? I want to make sure I know how to answer their questions because I really want to help them. And so I think that, that's a good result to see, that they know that conversation exists, and maybe even if they don't remember every exact argument they hear, they know that those answers are out there, and it gives them confidence in that.
Now, you had, in what it is that you're telling me, I'm seeing that you've got a certain kind of practice and perhaps exemplary practices that you use, in the bringing in of Father Spitzer's videos and in the engaging the students in reflections and so on. What would you recommend to other physics teachers as things they could do in their classrooms as exemplary practices to have the kind of impact that you're experiencing in your school?
Well, I know that, when I first started teaching, I wasn't really engaged in this faith conversation. I didn't really know a whole lot about it. And it was actually a workshop with Father Spitzer where I first learned about some of this stuff. And he just has great resources available that are very easy to use. They are easy to kind of teach yourself how to start this conversation. So I think that's the easiest place to start, is just to use what's already there. Some of this material is already kind of thought through for you as a place to begin, and then from there you can build on it with what's comfortable to you. And I think it's just important to establish an environment where it's encouraged to have this faith science conversation at whatever level that you're able to do it. And like I said, you can start simply with resources that are already created and then build with what works for you. But just being open to that conversation and letting students know that that's something that exists and that is important is a great place to start.
And that underscores a really great point, that when you first came into this, into teaching in this way, the faith conversation was something that was different from the kind of science conversation for which you had been hired. And for science teachers, in particular teachers of the hard sciences like physics or biology or chemistry, it would seem important, especially in a Catholic school setting, for them to come up with ways to have those conversations that would be in the light of their faith through their teaching of their science.
Yeah, definitely. I know when most of my education was in the kind of the public arena, and when I started teaching here, one of the things they tell you when you're a Catholic high school teacher is that it's not just the theology teachers and the campus ministers that are responsible for evangelizing your students. It's every teacher. And I know as a new teacher, I wasn't really sure what that looked like in physics. And I kind of had an idea, well, if it was a biology class, you could tie in evolution and how that all relates. But I wasn't really sure. And it was when I went to that workshop with Father Spitzer, that's what sort of kind of gave me the vision to know where to go with it and how to incorporate it.
Sure. And the big thing in physics, it would seem, would be the Big Bang. The idea that at a certain point in the past, creation came out of nothing. And, 14 billion years later, here we are. And I was just reading an article that says, well, maybe we're a billion years younger than we thought we were. Which begs the question in a lot of our minds is, okay, wait a second. If we're all stardust, how are we able to think? How are we able to engage practically in the world? How are we able to even have conversations like the ones that you and I are having? And are these questions of physics, if it comes out of the Big Bang, or are these questions of theology and of philosophy? And what is the relationship among these disciplines?
Right, yeah, definitely. My students are always surprised whenever we are watching these videos, and they'll ask some question, and I'll say, well, hang on, let's see what it says in Genesis, and I pull out a Bible, and they'll say, you're a science teacher, why do you have a Bible in your classroom? So even just little things like that is surprising to them. So I think it's a good conversation to have.
Certainly. Well, do you have any conversations, or are there any engagements at your school where science teachers and theology teachers come together to have discussion?
We don't really do anything formally. I know in the past I've talked with some of the theology teachers about Father Spitzer's materials. They've kind of had some experience with his work also. So we kind of have informal conversations about, especially with the freshmen, kind of thinking about what their, where they are in their faith development in terms of kind of the level at which you can teach them things like the Big Bang and stuff like that. So yeah, those kind of informal conversations exist.
What about between Rosati-Kain High School and other schools? Do theology professors or faith or science faculty, do they come together in any kind of meaningful way to have discussions across the schools about things that are happening? Are there any conferences or interdisciplinary conferences?
Well, I have attended some. That workshop I keep mentioning that I went to with Father Spitzer was a joint workshop for science and theology teachers, and that was sponsored by iTest, which you mentioned in the introduction. So I think places like that are great discussion for that, and I think that's something that is really something we can continue to work on and improve. This conversation would be to kind of share best practices with each other and approach it that way.
Well, it's a good thing organizations like iTest exist for that alone, simply to bring scientists and theologians together in conversation with one another.
Yeah, I've had some experience with that through iTest. I think they're really providing some opportunities for that.
You know, it might be useful for us to think on the diocesan level, at least in the Archdiocese of St. Louis, of school teachers coming together in order for interdisciplinary workshops on their own. You know, even if iTest weren't a hub or a networking entity for bringing school teachers together, that they would do it on their own simply because of all the science teachers in all the Catholic schools in St. Louis who are engaged in pretty much the same questions or have the same experiences. Do you think something like that would be useful?
Yeah, I definitely do. And I think we're fortunate here in St. Louis. We have a lot of Catholic schools, and I think that provides a lot of opportunities, potential opportunities for kind of collaboration and working together.
I'm thinking in terms of teaching level. High school is one level. What about parochial schools? Do the high schools contribute, or have you had the opportunity to contribute in ways that help those schools that are feeding students into you better prepare for these kinds of conversations when they hit high school?
I haven't personally had any kind of direct interaction like that. I can tell that there are some freshmen who have had these conversations more than others, so I think it varies by school. Some kids come in with a little bit of background in faith and science, and so I think that maybe trying to help schools where it's not being discussed as much, kind of bring that up more would be a great initiative.
Well, then, in just a short time, you and I have identified some opportunities that I would encourage any teacher in the high school or in the parochial schools to jump into and try to address, and that is collaboration among high school science teachers with theology teachers, and then collaboration between the levels of high school and middle school, perhaps, or even elementary school, in order to help prepare those conversations or those discussions as the students progress up to the high school level. I know that we've got some new atheists out there, people like Richard Dawkins, who are using the science of biology, which is a hard science, to say, hey, because evolution is a way in which our bodies could have formed, this proves that there is no God, because all we needed was deep time and it would have happened anyway. But they can't answer those questions of mind. You know, how did a rational intellect form from a cluster of cells? Or how did a mind form from a big bang? And the fact that we have the capacity to reflect is probably one of the strongest points of evidence that we didn't bring ourselves into being or just happened by chance or through an evolutionary process that would have magically brought us from a fish to a thinking human being. Are there any thoughts that you have or any concerns that you have in the faith-science conversation that you would like to talk about outside of anything we've already discussed?
I guess just one thing I would add is one of the reasons that I think it's important to teach is kind of what you mentioned, that some of the new atheists really want to dismiss God as obsolete. And I think it's really important for teenagers to understand that there is this God who unconditionally loves them. It's important for everybody, but especially teenagers. And, if they are constantly hearing this message that's just a silly idea, they're never going to know and experience that love. And, so we just need to help kids understand that science doesn't have all those answers. And as you mentioned, there are things that we can do, such as reflect, that points to something bigger. And I think it's important for them to have confidence in that knowledge, especially as they go to college and they're maybe approached or experience more people with varying ideas.
Well, we were talking about as well organizations that help, and you mentioned iTest. You're on the board of iTest.
Correct.
How would you like to see a faith science organization develop over the next several years in terms of addressing some of the needs that we've identified? I mean, I know that earlier I said, what are these schools doing on their own? And now we might ask the question, if a networking hub like iTest were to grow or were to advance itself in Catholic schools in a real way, in a meaningful way, what would be some of the things that you would like to see us do?
I think so. iTest has done some work in this area. As I mentioned, they sponsored a workshop with Father Spitzer, and they brought myself and a couple other teachers together a few years ago, teachers who were already using this information in their classes, just to kind of discuss and brainstorm a little bit. And so I think that's a good conversation to begin, and to start to see ways that iTest can support teachers collaborating kind of in the ways we've discussed, across grade level and across discipline, and just support that collaboration between them and provide opportunities for that conversation and that sharing of information.
Well, I think that the direction in which iTest is moving will help realize that idea that we have of better collaboration. So the idea of iTest as continuing in these directions is something that is going to be very important as a networking organization to bring teachers together, and hopefully not just networking but also resourcing, so that if there are things that we can do to help resource our teachers who are teaching science in the light of faith, that we would be in a position to do those things. And so one thing that I might say is that any Catholic school teacher listening to this interview or listening to this podcast that will be broadcast through WCAT radio, that you contact the station or you contact iTest directly, at itestfaithscience@gmail.com, and make suggestions. And if you would like to be a part of the work of iTest, to sign up, to join us as a member, and to participate in our activities and help us advance the mission of teaching science in the light of faith, especially for school children who, once they hit the university, may find themselves entering into a world that is not Catholic and that is very secular in its design, in a world that will do more to draw them away from their faith than it will to integrate what it is that they're studying, if it's engineering or mechanics or physics or any of the sciences, to pull them into a worldview that is materially reductive. So, Lauren, I just thank you so very much for your participation on our board and for your continued enthusiasm for the integration of faith and science in the teaching of our high school students.
Thank you very much for your work on this show.
Oh, sure, yeah. Would you like to give a shout-out to anybody? Your husband, 5 children, principal?
My husband, Joe, and my kids, Abby, Nate, Ben, Sam, and Gabe, and all my wonderful students and colleagues at Rosati-Kain.
Well, very good. Well, I hope that all of them have an opportunity to listen to this interview and to share with you in the work that you do at Rosati-Kain. In particular, if there are any other science teachers out there who would like to be interviewed, or theology teachers who would like to be interviewed in the way that they integrate faith and science in their own teaching, so that students, when they do discover the world, find an encounter with God. Please give us a call, and we'll set you up for an interview as well. Thank you, Lauren, and God bless you.
Thanks, Sebastian.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.